IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of your favorite daily public policy podcast, the Takshashila Institution's All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar. Thanks for joining me today, Amit.
Thanks for having me, Anushka.
For today's episode, we thought we'd delve into some of the ideas we discussed as part of a policy brief we submitted for consideration to the Think 20 working group of the G20 under India's presidency this year. We proposed that G20 countries must find a way to cooperate to mitigate asymmetry in crucial supply chain related information and data among the diverse set of stakeholders that are spread across these supply chains and other value chains in order to address disruptions that are induced by data and information asymmetry. And we believe that the G20 is best suited to create such a framework given that they constitute 20 of the world's largest economies and have had to directly confront the challenges of supply chain disruptions. So Amit, let me first come to you and ask, can you explain a little bit to our listeners the reasons why we witnessed some of these disruptions in global supply chains in the past few months and years? And what were the kind of observable instances of data asymmetry, which, as we understand it, means the inequitable distribution of essential information across the stakeholders in a supply chain? So, Amit, over to you.
Sure, Anushka. So let's turn back to 2021, when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak. The global economy went into a state of flux as supply chains were disrupted by a lack of coordinated efforts to understand lockdown-induced fluctuations in demand and supply. This was most stark in the shortage of semiconductor chips that are crucial to the manufacture of commodities from electronic gadgets like mobile phones to artificial intelligence and defense equipment. There were complex reasons for the supply chain disruption, of which three reasons were most prominent. Firstly, there was intense fluctuation in demand for chips. There was a rise in demand for gadgets required to work from home, like personal computers and laptops. At the same time, there was a fall in demand from smartphones and automobile manufacturers that were coping with slowed growth due to an overall reduction in consumer income. Secondly, work from home led to a sudden shift away from factory-intensive work, which disrupted the functioning of workforce in the chip industry. The extended quarantine times also negatively impacted the production rate. Thirdly, the supply of chips was interrupted by intensive lockdowns of borders, as well as the using up of the transport capacity for COVID-related exports. Ships and cargo planes faced pressures due to overutilization for the transport of vehicles, masks, and medicines, which also resulted in frequent engine failures while ships at dockyards struggled to enter borders, right? So in all these cases, better communication between various actors within the supply chain, from manufacturers to suppliers and private sellers to governments, as well as cooperation towards accessibility and transparency, could have used a more formalized mode of communication and exchange of information. For example, had there been a comprehensive repository on where chips were readily available and by when export endeavors could succeed, or had there been intergovernmental cooperation on logistic assistance for transport, coping with the above-mentioned COVID-induced disruptions, would have been dealt more effectively.
Right. And I think the three reasons you've given, right from the shift in the kind of work environment we saw during the pandemic to the kind of external barriers that were created due to the closing up of borders, kind of tells us how much data wasn't shared. And if it had been, some of the transport capacity you talked about could have been utilized judiciously, or an understanding of consumer demand in various parts of the world could have perhaps oriented the resource-crunched supply chains in a better manner.
Right. So let's deep dive further into this topic. And let me ask you, what are the potential reasons you have identified as to why the diverse stakeholders engaged in the supply chain may not necessarily find it beneficial to mitigate this data asymmetry that exists and thus withhold crucial information. Would you have any thoughts on it?
Right. So I think that's, of course, a valid deep dive into this topic, because we cannot just discuss the disruptions in supply chains and blame it on our ill preparedness. There is, of course, some incentive to also withholding this data. For example, one of the reasons I would give for this is that it is more profitable to sell data than to divulge it willingly. To put this simply, various actors, especially middlemen like consultancy firms, may hold information that may be crucial to other actors in, say, a decentralized supply chain. And this is information that they would rather sell as a service than enable their clients like manufacturers, suppliers, and exporters to store in a widely accessible repository, something that you proposed and talked about, right? A more formalized method of communication. Moreover, if you look at industry coalitions in chips, that's the example you took, right? So the Washington-based Semiconductor Industry Association and many others, they hold on to forecasting and other critical data and publish it in the form of yearly reports and client reports, right? That are again sold. For example, the 2022 report of the SIA costs around $3,756 for non-members to access. Similarly, Bloomberg has created this extensive supply chain database, which is advertised as a product of Bloomberg. And all of these are imperatives of weaponization of information, but also comparative advantage and capital profit, right? So this is kind of one reason to withhold information. The other, which doesn't necessarily accrue to benefits, but can indeed be blamed on our ill preparedness, is the fact that our information collection processes are erroneous. And there is not much digitization that is adopted in these assembly lines or associations where data is collected. So there are some analysts out there that suggest that upstream supply chain actors collect real-time data on production, what is the kind of demand that their clients and businesses have placed with them. And some of them do this by integrating new and emerging technologies into their assembly line. However, at the source, processes of collection still remain incoherent, complex, and sometimes they also lack willful effort. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Dell's example here. Dell digitized its supply chain, and that has helped deal significantly with semiconductor shortage. And supply and demand scenarios are simulated in their digital model, which allows them to make decisions to either prioritize or cut down on certain stock keeping units when supply is running low. And more companies are now turning towards digitization with the aim of increasing their supply chain agility in order to respond quickly to demand and supply volatility and the wide varieties of tech that they deploy that can include radio frequency identification tags, sensors, GIS information systems, barcodes, so on and so forth. So I think having established these challenges, I want to come back to you, Amit, and ask, what then do you think is the identifiable role of the G20 in all this? I mean, we did mention in the start that because the G20 are the world's 20 biggest economies, they should care about this. But how should they approach this going forward?
Right. So as supply chains are disrupted by crises like COVID-19 pandemic, the burden of a range of issues from consumer satisfaction to saving manufacturers, retailers, and exporters from debt falls on policymakers in some way, right? In such a scenario, if governments of G20 nations can enable transparent and accessible sharing of information by industry actors, they can strengthen their own policy outcomes. I propose that the G20 countries should work towards a data governance model to create a mutually beneficial situation for both the government and the private sector. The two key aspects of this envisioned data governance model would entail data collection and data science. And I'll have into these briefly and would love to hear your thoughts too.
Right. I think before we do that, it's best to kind of understand what exactly data asymmetry is and what's the kind of nature of data asymmetry that we have to deal with, right? I think there are 5 types of data models that we should take into account from the example of the pandemic. And these should be areas of priority where data asymmetry indeed needs to be addressed and curbed, right? So in a supply chain, there can be various types of data. As I mentioned, 5 of them are priority, right? One is sales and demand data, right? This is inclusive of customer data. It helps us understand the demand for products and services, customer preferences, buying habits, so on and so forth. And what this does is it allows stakeholders to forecast future demand and optimize inventory levels accordingly. The second is supplier data, which is information about suppliers' lead times, quality ratings, pricing, and all of these again help the rather downstream supply chain stakeholders to select their optimal suppliers and negotiate favorable terms. And then this in turn helps stakeholders provide optimal prices to their consumers. The third is inventory data, which is how stakeholders understand what the current level of their stock keeping units and inventories is. And then they use this to track the movement of products throughout the supply chain and also assess how much more or less of this a certain product they need, right? The fourth is transportation data, which is information about routes, shipping times, whether or not borders are closed and open, what are the export barriers and import controls one needs to look out for, and of course, the costs of transportation, which help stakeholders optimize their shipping and delivery processes. And the fifth is financial data. This is again larger information about costs and cash flow, which is necessary for stakeholders to manage their finances and make informed decisions about investments and growth. Because like we discussed, the COVID-19 pandemic saw a crunch of resources, and prioritizing finances by the collection of this data is absolutely essential, right? So given this wide variety of data available, there is also a wide variety of asymmetries, information asymmetries within supply chains that emerge from this. This can be demand information asymmetry, capacity information asymmetry, which largely has to do with inventory levels and transportation, quality and disruption information asymmetry, inventory information asymmetry, and price and objective function level information asymmetries, which again have to do with what is the kind of demand at a certain price level and how should companies manage their objective finances. So now that we have a perspective into the diverse set of information sets and information asymmetries that are available, we are rather better off discussing the model that you were talking about and deep diving into the processes you termed as data collection and data science. So Amit, over to you.
Yeah, thanks Anushka. Thanks for bringing, I'm so glad that you brought all those different kinds of asymmetry in data that exist and different data in like inventory data and etc. that exist, because these are the sets of data that would go into governance model that they proposed in our paper. Right. So on data collection between governments and private entities, the government is, this is my view, that the government is best equipped with the function of data collection in a cost-effective manner because of its ability to coordinate between various supply chain actors that may not be in sync with each other. The most potent tool at the government's disposal is taxation. The fact that government collects taxes at multiple levels and at every level of the value chain allows them to create a robust and integrated data infrastructure at relatively minimal costs compared to private entities that engage in supply chain related data collection, right? So besides, governments also act as gatekeepers for various clearances of goods and services across domestic and international borders. So the issue at present is that the government across the world in general do not leverage this capacity or capability to collect data and apply it for public needs. The gaps thus created allows private entities to step in and address the data asymmetry, albeit at increased economic cost. However, because governments have the power to make policy and influence industry, they can mandate the collection of data at all source points. Moreover, the sources of data sets on supply chains already includes government records in addition to other private players in the supply chain. However, because data is not properly maintained or not accessible, data collection becomes a costly affair for private entities. This inefficiency could be removed if governments leverage their tax records and mandate all actors involved in the supply chain to collect their inventory data at source point and share it with the government so that such data can be stored at a single source. On data science, the second pillar of this data governance model, insofar as private entities are concerned, they must be encouraged to specialize primarily in data science, which includes data interpretation and offering consultancy services. Once private entities and consultancy firms are relieved of their duties of data collection, the overall supply chain will become more efficient and transparent and create greater scope for improved functional specialization. It will hence bring down consultancy fees by removing the costs associated with data collection. The anticipated loss of revenue, there are obvious questions that if private sector is moved out of data collection, it would lead to loss of revenue. But this anticipated loss of revenue for these large consultancies could be offset by their increased consumer basis, which will likely expand as their consultancy fees drops after being relieved of data collection. Because data collection is the segment which requires more investment and is more cost intensive. This shall in no way mean that private entities are barred from maintaining their own data bank, right? So this is the model that I had in my mind, and we proposed a model, and I would like to have your thoughts on it. But also moving ahead, what do you have to say about this governance model, Anushka?
Right. So I think it's extremely interesting to kind of draw that line between the kind of roles governments and private entities can play to have those corners drawn out. But at the same time, it's also important to see where these two actors can come together and collaborate and how they can each assuage each other's concerns, right? So governments can leverage the data sources they already have, such as tax records, and private companies can be compliant in whatever kind of such data governance models run by governments would require. But at the same time, governments can encourage opportunities for private sector companies and consultancy firms, which is, I think, one of my ideas. And I'll talk about it before, on data collection. In the past, G20 has collaborated with the International Monetary Fund, that's the IMF, through this idea called the Data Gaps Initiatives to study and work through deficiencies and information and data linkages, right? And as part of the last Data Gap Initiative, which was Data Gap 3.0, in collaboration with the IMF, the G20 had particularly worked on looking at asymmetry in supply chains that is caused by stakeholders withholding information or monetizing on it, right? So as part of maybe a new endeavor called DGI-4, G20 countries may even resolve to create a single source of data entry for all supply chain actors as part of the G20 Secretariat, right? And even governments can leverage a nominal fee on a digital dashboard of this sort, which will perhaps best serve this purpose of a public repository and can be maintained by this working group that exists under the G20 Secretariat's finance track, which is called the International Financial Architecture. I think this particular working group is best suited to kind of take this particular decision. And at the same time, the process of governments creating a parallel framework for data collection cannot solely be conducted during or after trigger events. And this must be a continuous exercise in order for them to make crucial information readily available at all times. And they should have the time and understanding to react to unusual disruptions. So I think for this to take place, it is recommended that G20 governments encourage the integration of emerging technologies like Internet of Things and blockchain within sites of manufacturing and production to allow for real-time information collection at the source. Again, this is a monetary cost supply chain assembly lines have to bear, but again, this would be a solution to be worked out, perhaps incentives, subsidies, for this type of integration of technology, right? Because the IoT is making inventory management more intelligent. It is optimizing key warehousing processes and lowering labor costs to improve operations. IoT can also provide advantages for transportation activities in supply chains. And India has already been using some of these processes. For example, the Tamil Nadu Government Center for Excellence in Emerging Technologies uses blockchain to maintain a tamper-proof ledger of registration documents. And this can also be integrated by private firms in G20 countries in a synchronized format to synergize and make data storage processes more kind of consistent, right? And I know I've had too much to say on this, but quickly on data science, I think consultancy firms could enlarge their consumer base if they use this model and opportunity significantly, right? They can make profits based on the endeavor of analyzing data trends and predicting demand and supply fluctuations. And the availability of data as a public good or as a G20 good will allow several small and medium consultancy firms also to emerge that could have otherwise not competed with major and established consultancy firms due to huge costs associated with data collection, even though they may possess skill sets related to data interpretation and consultancy. So here also governments will have a role to play. First, they will have to publicize new opportunities for small and medium level data scientists. And second, they will have to provide incentives for data interpretation and consultancy, specifically catering to the supply chain actors that are most affected by disruptions, which is again the MSMEs. So Amit, with this, I'd have one final question for you, which is there an area where you can see both roles and both governments and private entities come together?
Yes, I do see an area of cooperation where both government and the private sector can come together. So we talked about governance, the data collection process, right? And I say that the government is best or is the most efficient body to play a role in data collection. But by that, by no means I mean that the private sector should be excluded from this area, right? So of course the government will come and play a role here, but there still would be gaps wherein private sector would be required. So once G20 governments identify hidden or nexus suppliers, as in the case of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, such nodes in the supply chain can be leveraged to understand how collected data is processed and used for prediction and supply chain efficiency. These nodes possess massive amounts of information about future fluctuations in supply chains and other critical market information that can provide early signs of changes in economic conditions and as a result, the supply and demand.
Right. So by nodes, you mean suppliers or major actors in supply chains, right, that not only are involved in the processes of the supply chain, but also possess heavy duty information.
Right. And not only can governments collaborate with and learn from such nexus suppliers, they can eventually also enable them to sell their collected data, governments, instead of weaponizing it in times of crisis. It is these nodes that ultimately need to follow up on the government's push for making data transparent and data collection process efficient.
Absolutely. That makes sense because the G20 countries can put a data governance model in place, but it will ultimately have to be done in cooperation and collaboration with private sectors and suppliers. And of course, business consortiums that will be lobbying to have their interests met as much as the interests of other stakeholders like consumers. I think on a concluding note, data asymmetry uniformly impacts industries across all countries and especially G20 countries because of, again, their massive economic size, but also the intense amount of trade activity that they engage in. And there exists a meeting point to address this issue, as Amit argued, keeping aside strategic differences. And in the past, countries with fundamental differences have cooperated on issues of mutual interest. With some difficulties, this can be overcome as well. And at the same time, in the domain of supply chains, mitigation of disruptions can be achieved if curbing data asymmetry is the first thing to be tackled. That said, thank you so much, Amit, for your insights on this podcast. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.